From 1945 to 1995, we thought the ultimate way to engage people and build brands was sex. What the algorithms figured out when Google came along was that the ultimate branding tool was rage.
We stayed indoors during COVID. We didn't go to school, we didn't go to university because we were protecting older generations and our loved ones. And what have we got back for it? Political parties who don't care about us.
Constantly, men are being told, you're the problem, you're part of this system which is benefiting men and putting women and other people down. Yet at the same time, they're not seeing any of the benefits of that.
Hello everybody and a very warm welcome to Control Alt Deceit, a podcast designed to dive deep into the threats facing our democracies and to ask just how much danger are they in these days. I'm Nina Dos Santos, former CNN anchor and international broadcaster.
And I'm Owen Bennett-Jones, former BBC foreign correspondent, now teaching here at New York University.
As you probably saw from that introductory clip, this show is all about identifying the trends that are influencing our perceptions of Western institutions and essentially giving them something of a health check for our hard-won rights and freedoms. You can probably tell from the name of the podcast what we're trying to do is figure out who's controlling the narrative, having a look at which alternative facts they're using to do that, and also figuring out where all this deception is likely to lead.
And on this week's podcast, we are delving into the gender gap that's emerging in politics. Why is there a tendency for young women to be moving left in their political affiliations and young men to be moving right? So that's coming up in this week's edition of Control Alt Deceit.
Well, we've heard a lot about how Western societies are becoming increasingly polarised alongside more traditional political fault lines, but increasingly those types of splits are manifesting themselves beyond traditional gender divides. We're also talking about younger people as well splitting further towards the political seams. Let's just have a look at some of the figures just to lay this landscape out for you. As you can see here, young women are twice as likely to vote Green. They're more likely, obviously, to vote the left of the political spectrum in many cases, especially in the UK. And now, this is crucial, we're going to get into this throughout the course of this hour, more university graduates who are women are earning more than young men for the first time. We've seen that flip. About 60% of college graduates in the United States are now women. And as you can see, in Germany, we've seen in the last election on February the 27th that the Left Party was very much supported by women over there.
And for men, if we can see that slide, the converse obviously is true. Twice as likely to vote Reform here in the UK, the party that would be roughly aligned with the Trump MAGA movement in the US. In strong support amongst young men for AfD in Germany, for the successor to the Front National, the RN in France. And of course, 60% of graduates are women, only 40% are men.
Yeah, and I had a chance to speak to another member of the NYU professorial team and the faculty over in New York. His name is Scott Galloway. We spoke at the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona recently, and he's been a voice who's specifically focused in on this disaffectation of young men and the separation between women and men at the fringes of the political spectrum. He claims that this may prompt an age of revolution. Let's have a listen to a snippet of that conversation now.
I think it can all be reverse engineered back to one basic statistic, and that is a 30-year-old man or woman isn't doing as well as his or her parents were at 30. And that's economic. But you layer on top of that what I think is the biggest crisis in the United States that is creating a generation of anxious, obese, and depressed youth that is really dissatisfied with the current world order and so just wants disruption and change. And that is, I think the biggest threat of AI is loneliness. And that is the deepest pocketed, most intelligent companies in the world that have aggregated more human capital than NASA or Google have one mission. And that mission is to, unfortunately, produce an asexual, asocial species of people who do nothing but stare at their phone. Because if they just stare at their phone all day, they can monetize them.
There was a recent survey that showed that more young women are being paid more than young men entering the workforce. And that was the first time that we'd really seen that balance flip. Where do you think this is going to lead in the immediate term?
We should take a collective victory lap and recognize that no group has ascended faster globally than women. We should do nothing to get in the way of the progress of women, full stop. And what I do think is happening, though, is people are starting to realize that the data is overwhelming and that the group that has fallen further fastest in the West is young men. If you go into a morgue and you find 5 people who have died by suicide, 4 are men. We don't have a male homeless problem. We don't have a homeless problem, we have a male homeless problem. 3/4 of homeless are men. 70% of addicts are men. Men are 12 times as likely to be incarcerated, 3 times as likely to be addicted. I coach young men. I think the term toxic masculinity has been very unproductive. There's no such thing as toxic masculinity. There's violence, there's cruelty, there's arrogance, there's bullying, but I don't think there's any such thing as toxic femininity. And I think that young men need to rely on masculinity as a bit of a code.
The men who we see on the world stage representing the United States, in particular the so-called broligarchy of technos, are the antithesis of exactly what you're advocating. You, because you've been an investor, a big voice in this space, you can probably look these people in the eye as a successful tech investor. What do you see? What do you think their agenda really is in the end of the day?
As a nation gets wealthier, its reliance on a super being and church attendance goes down. But into that void of wanting answers steps technology and this idolatry of money and idolatry of tech innovators. Because the closest thing we have to religion is technology. It's literally godlike. I don't understand how my phone works. And we have told these people that the rules don't apply to them. There's sort of this philosophy of being part of the in-group. And the in-group in America right now are engineers who have made a lot of money in technology. And then there's the out-group, and that's kind of everybody else. And the in-group believes that the law protects them but doesn't bound them. Whereas everybody else, the out-group, they're bound by the law, but they're not protected by it. So you have, it started with Steve Jobs. We had someone who was kind of the capitalist Jesus Christ, and this was a guy, and we still idolize him and talk about him in hushed tones. This was a guy who denied his own blood under oath when he was worth, to avoid child support payments, when he was worth $250 million. And the new Jesus Christ is Elon Musk amongst young men in a Western society. And this is a guy who says his daughter after transition is dead to him. This is a guy who has 2 women currently suing him for sole custody of their children because he's had no involvement with them. That's what it means to be a man? I mean, the role models we are putting forward across tech, this idolatry of technology and the dollar, is producing just some of the shittiest men with this extraordinary amount of power. And it's not their fault. If you tell a 35 or a 40-year-old man he's Jesus Christ, he's inclined to believe you. It's our fault. We don't hold these people to the same standards.
It appears as though the constituency, and for politicians around the world complain about this, the constituency is increasingly a digital constituency that's hyper-manipulatable as well. Do you think that's going to be part of what could prompt this age of revolution?
Well, if you think about, so again, I'm a professor of brand strategy. From 1945 to 1995, we thought the ultimate way to engage people and build brands was sex, right? Drink this beer and you're going to be hot. Buy an $11,000 watch so you don't whine and you'll be more likely to have a random sexual encounter, right? And it works really well. Show me anything that's high margin on my body, or probably on yours, and it's because we still have this instinct we want to be more attractive to mates, potential mates. We thought that was the ultimate branding kind of tool. What the algorithms figured out when Google came along was that the ultimate branding tool was rage. That if you can enrage someone, if you can put out false content that mRNA vaccines alter your DNA, people get enraged. Some people weigh in and say, that's right, they've been lying to us. And then other people weigh in and say, no, that's misinformation, that's stupid. And every additional comment is another Nissan ad and more shareholder value. And you're seeing this just, our discourse has become so coarse, right? Depression is skyrocketing. Incumbent governments are being kicked out one after the other because it's not sex that sells anymore, it's rage.
I should say some of the students from New York University are in the audience here, and I don't know whether I'm encouraged or dismayed that some of them are nodding when they hear about rage of being a key factor in what's going on. We've got a great panel here to discuss what's happening and to help us understand what's going on. We'll hear in a moment from Oliver Dean, who's with the Conservative Party here in the UK, which I guess is now called something like a centre-right party. All those, you can tell us, and all those definitions have sort of rather gone by the way now. And we've also got Sophie Stowers, Research Associate at UK in a Changing Europe, writes on British and European politics, and you're a parliamentary assistant until recently?
Until about 4 years ago, on the other side of the spectrum, I work for a Labour MP.
You work for a Labour MP, and you have been thinking about, why women are moving left, and you've written on that, and sort of suggesting it's being rather ignored as compared to the trend of young men moving right. So, let's just focus in on that. Why do you think young women tend to be moving left in not just Britain but all over the world?
Well, we know, my research focuses primarily on the UK, and we know that in the UK, for a long time, actually, the trend was the other way around. Women were more traditionally likely to vote for the Conservative Party and men for the Labour Party, for kind of primarily because men tended to be more exposed to, trade unions, to kind of work movements, involved in manual work. Women tended to be more religious as well on top of that. And so those kind of, socioeconomic factors tended to drive men and women in those directions. We saw gradually that gap eroding over time until in around 2005 it flipped for the first time. So women became more likely to vote Labour, and that gap across kinds of age groups has maintained itself ever since then. But what we've seen, particularly in the last kind of, since 2016, I'd probably say in the UK, is this emergence of, the gap itself has widened. So women are continuously more likely to vote for parties on the left than men are, but particularly amongst young generations. So we're talking about voters who are aged between 18 and 29. And as you said, we've talked quite a lot, I think, post-US election, post-UK election, about what is driving, the youngest male voters to the right. And we tend to look at, these socio-cultural issues of, the manosphere, is that having an effect? Do men not have a sense of identity? Why are men more concerned about migration and these social cultural issues than women tend to be? And we talk a lot about that, but actually I think as you kind of referred to, what I think gets ignored quite a lot is that women are moving to the left, at maybe not quite at the same pace, but it is occurring. And when we look at what the differentiating factor is there, it tends to be because they have these kind of more left-wing economic preferences, and they also tend to put a lot more emphasis on their economic priorities, their financial security, than these socio-cultural issues that seem to be driving male voters.
It's very interesting you say that, because I was reading an article, academic article on what's happening in Germany, and they were saying that women were moving left since the 1970s. Is a consistent trend. So it completely predates all the social media stuff, because it's very tempting now, whatever happens, to say it's social media. But it's not social media. I mean, that may be part of the story, but the origins of this go pre-social media.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, this might have been something that was a slow burn for a long time. And maybe social media has been the catalyst that has sped it up so that, this youngest generation seems to be more polarised than any that have come before it. But as you said, it's been happening for quite a long time. But I think, the widening of it is something quite recent. If you look at work by people like Rosie Campbell, who's a professor at King's College, as recently as 2022, she found no kind of real statistically significant difference in the economic preferences or the social preferences of men and women. Whereas now we're seeing that on these really fundamental issues of, environment, migration, redistributive policy, tax policy, men and women are moving in quite different directions. So what is it that has happened in that relatively short space of time?
And yet, one of the interesting things about this is that both men and women think they're disadvantaged. Women for historical reasons which they think are still relevant, and men feeling they're newly disadvantaged. So, it's grievance all round, right?
Yeah, 100%. I think, if you look at kind of what is at the heart of both that concern of men and women, it is that feeling of security, I think, but it manifests in quite different ways. I think for a lot of young women, it's financial security. It's, feeling vulnerable, maybe, you've gone to university, you've done everything you're meant to do, but you still can't get a good job. They're experiencing, a lack of housing, a lack of job opportunities, and that manifests that way. Now, young men obviously also have that concern too, but I think that might also then be compounded by the fact that we're seeing there's a generation of younger men who may not have attended university, who feel a bit lost, a bit isolated. And then the world's also changed, you know, quite drastically around them, in that they don't have this place to be like a breadwinner in a household anymore. They may not have that traditional kind of masculine path to follow that they've seen their previous generations of their father or their grandfather follow. And so that kind of just, I think, compounds that lack of security.
We'll get onto some of that with Oliver just now, but just before we do that, in the literature it seems to be saying men feel more socially isolated. And I had trouble understanding that. Why would men feel more socially isolated than women?
I think based on kind of research that other people have done, and this is where like focus groups I think is really fundamental, because actually talking out these issues can help to unpack a lot of that kind of, you know, these kinds of phenomena that feel quite difficult to understand. How can someone feel isolated in a world where it's easier to reach out and talk to people than ever before? And I think actually, okay, we have this massive increase in communication and, you know, availability to talk to people over the world, but actually what we're seeing is people retreating into small kind of localized bubbles where people agree with them, you know, these echo chambers. And I don't think that's necessarily, you know, a constructive thing for people who are already maybe feeling politically isolated. They then isolate themselves socially too, and it compounds that.
Yeah, but do you think men are more affected by that than women?
I think they might be, yeah, and I think that's partially because I think women, I think there tends to be a lot more kind of sense of shared space and shared experience, I think, between women than men tend to have, and that is just based on my own experience, you know.
So we just heard there from Scott Galloway just a snippet of his conversation, but more broadly, and on the podcast, when it's released, we'll hear a little bit more of what he had to say. But he was saying that more young men are spending more time online, they're more isolated as a result, and as such, their political views are more likely to go towards the extreme, and in particular the extreme right. Whereas, as you're saying, Sophie, you know, women are gravitating towards the left, but not always the extreme left. That's the issue, isn't it? Let me bring in Oliver, because obviously, as I was just pointing out, your party is not far right, you're centre right. What do you make of this debate? Because your side of the political spectrum has actually delivered 3 female prime ministers in this country, the leaders of the AFD and the what used to be the Front National and is now the National Rally in France. Marine Le Pen, up until recently, has been a woman. Yeah. Why do you think that men are gravitating towards the right if there are so many powerful female figures running the right?
So there was this fantastic report published by the Centre for Social Justice in March 2025 titled Lost Boys. And it details this wave, this generation of young men who feel as though they're lost not only in society, but in terms of their, you know, relationships with their parents, in terms of their views towards women, in terms of their, you know, space at university and so forth. And I think a lot of it comes down to this idea that a lot of men feel as though, young men particularly, feel as though they are the problem within society. And that's partly fueled by things like social media and traditional media. But they're constantly being told that, you know, they are the problem. They've helped prop up this system that has put down other groups of people in society. And so they're being told that they've you know, erected this system, but at the same time, they're not feeling the benefits of that system. So, I mean, we discussed some of the statistics at the start, but we're seeing more women go to university than men. The report by the CSJ also highlights that now, one of the first times in history, women are earning more than men. The unemployment rate is lower for women than it is for men. So constantly, men are being told, you're the problem, you're part of this system which is benefiting men and putting women and other people down. Yet at the same time, they're not seeing any of the benefits of that. And so as a result of that, I think young men are turning around and basically saying, well, why would I want to continue propping up this establishment, propping up this system that hasn't worked for me and it's telling me that I am basically the bad person in all of this. And, you know, I authored a piece for City AM on why so many young men are voting for reform. And I think one of the key things that reform and other right-wing challenger parties across Europe, and perhaps even the United States, are doing particularly well with men, is they're tapping into this sense of disenfranchisement and this sense that they're being lost, and they're basically giving these young men a voice, and they're saying, look, you aren't, the problem in society, you aren't being put down. And that's appealing to young men who feel like they've got nothing, and so they're turning to these more extreme parties.
They're giving them an identity.
Yeah.
And as you were pointing out before, that's sometimes quite a negative identity,
Yeah.
particularly online. How does a centre-right party like yours capture that energy if it's negative and turn it into something positive?
Yeah. And this is a significant problem, and there are many, and I'm not talking on behalf of the Conservative Party, I'm a member, I'm not aligned with them in terms of their staff, but there are some in the party who, when you raise this issue about, how are we going to win back these younger voters from the more extreme sides of the right, what are our long-term solutions? And time and again, they say it's just a phase, it's going to, trail off, and this is all going to return to normal. We've had this political system for hundreds of years. We've had the two-party system for hundreds of years. Everything's going to return to normal in 2029 or 2034 or whatever. I cannot emphasize this enough. That is categorically incorrect. What we're seeing is not normal. The rise of right-wing extremist parties and populist parties, not just in the UK, but across the world, is not normal. It is in retaliation. I think the solution is we need to be looking to put forward policies that actually put young people, not just young men, but young people first. And one of the things I bring about in the City AM article is young people really don't feel as though there's anything much to conserve. We're called the Conservative Party, and I can safely say, if we're all young people here. If I ask you if there's anything worth conserving in the UK and ask you to put your hand up, I guarantee most of you wouldn't even bother putting your hand up. And
They probably would, they're Americans.
well, they're American, yeah.
And you're not young,
If
neither am I.
If you take, a group of, British young people and you say, look, is there anything worth conserving? I doubt more than 10 would put their hand up in a room of about 100. And you have to look at it and, the housing crisis means that young people can't get on the housing ladder. They're entering into a job market, which is the most competitive it's ever been, and AI is not doing much to help that. So there needs to be this systemic, I don't want to say overhaul, but this change to actually put young people at the centre of policies and ideas and make sure that they feel as though they're actually being listened to.
So if you look at, for instance, the 2022 election in South Korea, there were some people who said that was a classic example of, disaffected young men actually skewing the result of a major election in a country. Do you think that could happen in Europe?
I think yes. I mean, obviously it's dependent
Where?
on, well, I think in the UK, for example, and I think we're seeing that, with, for example, 17-year-olds who aren't yet able to vote when they were asked. There was a survey conducted by YouGov when they were asked if they could vote, who would they vote for? 12% of 17-year-olds said that they would vote Reform, and those 12% of women, aged 17, said that they were going to vote Reform. 35% of men said they were going to vote Reform. So that's almost 3 times as high. And if this sense of disillusionment continues, if this sense of we're not being listened to continues, and it runs through generations that are coming up to be eligible for vote, then I think we're going to see in 2029 it's going to be a stark difference.
Can I just ask you to come in on this, Sophie? You're hearing this comment that, within the Conservative Party, here's a young man saying, listen to us, and they're all saying, no worry, it's just a phase, it'll all pass. Do you agree it's not just a phase?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I think there's research out there that is showing that Generation Z, however we want to say it, are the most polarised based on gender lines, and the most likely to support the far right out of the gate as soon as they're at voting age, and that tendency is only reinforcing itself over time, and it's actually becoming more kind of baked in and hardened over time, so they're less likely to look for parties on kind of the moderate centre and more likely to stick to extremes over their voting history. So, if you think that your formative political years are, that 18 to 24 period, this is a whole political generation that is being socialised into politics at the extremes.
Sophie, how do you think AI, I'll ask you both this question, how do you think AI is going to inflame this trend? Presumably it's going to put rockets on the back of it, right?
I mean, I would imagine that if AI, and this is someone who's speaking with a very weak understanding of how AI works, but as far as I understand it, AI is trained on kind of existing literature, existing responses to things that are out there, and it can learn how to elicit a response that, as in that video that said, that rage bait, what gets the most engagement. I think if that's how we're training this technology to interact with us, then it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that, the content that it produces, if it's, farming engagement and clicks and attention, then it is catering to those extremes, because as that speaker said, you're not only getting the people who agree with it on maybe the far right or the far left, but you're getting the other side having the argument with them as well. And I do worry that eliminates kind of the basis for consensus in the middle ground.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant to say it's going to put rockets on the back. I think it's definitely going to speed it up. I don't think it's going to be as fast as you suggest it will be. But, I brought up as well just now the impact of AI in the workforce and how that's going to impact things. And again, if we're seeing unemployment statistics with young men higher than with young women, and we're seeing more AI being used in the workplace, which is going to mean that many jobs are going to be made redundant or be phased out, that's going to do little to help the situation.
Okay, well, look, the format we're hoping to follow, having heard basically where you're both coming from and that incredibly articulate description of the problem, is to throw this open to the audience here. I should explain that we've got students from New York University who are studying in London. They're here for a semester. I've done a rough count trying to screen out adults who may not be students. And I think we've got about twice as many female students as male students, which tells a story in itself, probably. So very keen to hear from everyone in the audience, or anyone in the audience who wants to make a comment. We have a roving microphone. And I see, so one of them is with our two guests who are now going to share a microphone. And so raise a hand if you'd like to contribute to this debate. Yep.
And feel free to say who you are if you wish.
I'm Kieran. My question is, putting policy to one side, how much do you think personality plays a part in this, in terms of if you're a young man, you're feeling powerless, and you see someone like, I don't know, Donald Trump, who seems to be able to bend the world to his will almost, how much of that is there an intoxicating effect of looking at someone like that who seems to be so powerful? Is that something that is driving young men towards
masculine role models?
Yes, and this feeling of being powerless, and yet seeing this like quote unquote great man of history sort of bending the world to his will.
I think it definitely does play a part. I mean, I can just cite, the most recent general election, that if you look at young men and young women, they have different issue priorities. But in a lot of ways, if you ask them about what they want from their lives, what they think is most important, their economic priorities, their social views, in a lot of ways, they're pretty similar. But actually something that is a really clear, distinct kind of distinguishing factor between them is that young women really don't like Nigel Farage. So I think it's about over 70% of young women said they strongly dislike Nigel Farage. And so I do think if he wasn't such a repellent figure to young women, would they be much more likely to vote for reform than they actually are already? And in the same way, young men...
Let's break in to explain, just for people who are listening abroad. Nigel Farage, the leader of the Reform Party in the UK, the insurgent party in the UK, roughly aligned with the Trump MAGA movement, and the one we're all talking about as being on the far right and attracting a lot of male support.
Yeah.
Who's finally got into Parliament this year.
Yeah, exactly. So just I think, and young men really like him. So is he such an important figure in attracting those young men and repelling the young women? And if you change the dynamics of the leadership of that party or the Green Party or whatever party it is, how does that shift things? So I do think personality is a really important factor.
So 1 second, can I just add before you answer Kieran's question, Oliver? Just to talk about the opposite here, Sophie, I know I asked you this, Oliver, before, but let's face it, the top echelons of the Labour Party in the UK haven't yet delivered a Prime Minister. Some socialist parties across Europe haven't delivered leaders, female leaders. They've got women to the front bench, but that's after decades of supposedly feminist socialist movements. Where's the roadblock?
To be honest, that's something...
Since we're talking about role models here.
I mean, that's something that I definitely think about myself, having been involved in the Labour Party previously. And to be honest, I mean, I honestly don't know the answer to that question. My instinct is to say that because it was founded as a trade union supported party, which we know tend to be still quite male-dominated organisations, a lot of the infrastructure of the Labour Party to this day is still quite male dominated. I mean, I would suppose that that will partly play a factor. I mean, my other kind of work and theory is that a lot of women who tend to be Labour lean and Labour support, and we know tend to come from lower income backgrounds, may not have the time, the resources to campaign and get into politics. It's very expensive to become an MP, and so maybe we have a difficulty with, you know, channeling women from the backgrounds that tend to be Labour supporting into politics. It's a resource thing, but I mean, I think it is definitely a conversation that the Labour Party has to have with itself, I think.
So it was Kieran, right? Okay. So there was a poll done a few months ago that asked Gen Z whether they would support strongman populist governments like dictatorships, one-party governments. And I think the statistic was 54% of Gen Z would support a non-democratic means of government. I think that says basically everything about the situation. And I think a lot of that is to do with these strongman leaders who are coming through, who are showing that, you know, there's a different way to achieve goals in politics, and it isn't going through the same bureaucratic, democratic means as everybody else. But I think part of it as well is there's almost this sense of complacence with the younger generation, with this idea of liberal democracy. You know, Gen Z from 1997 through to 2012, we've never really seen the impact of how non-democratic states operate. We never saw the impact of the Soviet Union. We never saw, you know, these other forms of autocratic states throughout the 70s and the 80s. And as a result of that, we don't really know how different it is from liberal democracy. And so when we see liberal democracy failing, we're not saying, okay, well, how do we change the systems within liberal democracy to make it better for ourselves and to make the system work for us? We're thinking, how do we change the system itself away from liberal democratic means to achieve what we want to achieve? And I think it's that complacency and that lack of recognition for, you know, the true difference in democratic systems and non-democratic systems that young people don't necessarily realise, and they don't see how dangerous it is. And they're willing to look to different systems as a result of that. And I think that's very dangerous.
Any more questions?
I have a question. I hope this, oh, sorry. My name's Fiona. I hope this isn't too long-winded, but I'm just wondering what you think the implications are of, I mean, something that we've talked about in class is the differences in free speech in America and the UK. And specifically in Britain, I think we're seeing a lot of like push for wider free speech laws. I know obviously in America we covet our free speech. It's like the one thing, like our First Amendment right, whatever. But I think that I'm wondering what you think the implications are in the UK specifically, especially because of what you mentioned, this rise of manospheres, specifically incel forums, especially like with that Netflix special that came out, Adolescence, I think touches heavily on the rise of manospheres, specifically in young men. And I do think that there are real-world implications, specifically in America with the Santa Monica attacks in 2014. So I don't think it's something...
Remind us what happened there.
I can't remember his name. His name escapes me. But there was basically this guy who was posting videos on YouTube about how he couldn't get a girlfriend, or he felt like women were the reason for everything that was going wrong in his life. He had a whole manifesto, and I think he shot or maybe stabbed 2 people or 3 people in Santa Monica.
Okay, before we ask for answers to that from our guests, can I just say we're also interested in comments from you. You don't have to ask things in question form. If you've got a remark you want to make that will add to the debate, we're delighted to hear from you. We want to hear your voices as students about this issue. Maybe we'll just take a couple more comments before we come to you guys. So there's a question or comment at the back. Yep.
Hi, my name is Francisco. I study at LSE. And my question is, do you really think it's important for both the Labour Party and also the Conservative Party to almost like pander to young voters? Because a lot of times young people say that they might support reform, but do they have a high propensity to actually go vote once they get of age? So is it really worth these 2 major parties focusing on these young voters, while they could maybe focus on like middle-aged or older voters who have a high propensity to vote in elections?
Actually, young voters don't matter.
That's an excellent point. Come on, Owen, let's be honest.
Because they never turn up. Yeah. And there's one more here.
policies are,
Hello, my name is Mubin. I'm from LSE. And just two comments. Firstly, I wanted to comment on what you said regarding the
Could you put the microphone towards you?
Sorry. So regarding the consequences of the autocratic regimes, and sometimes I think when we think about autocratic regimes, we think only about bad examples. But what about UAE, for example? What about Singapore and organized economic, social, political lives? And I think about the comment that was made before me, like two people before me. I think we should bear in mind that sometimes when we think about the US, the press is not fully open, and sometimes when we think about I think too much also of too many voices can lead to tyranny of majority, like in a sense that sometimes masses who are not educated enough, as referring to Mill, can be dangerous in their ideas. So what do you think about that?
Thank you.
Only NYU graduates and LSE graduates should have the decision-making power. Perhaps.
You're an LSE graduate and you teach at NYU. Goodness. So let's circle back on some of those comments.
Yeah, we'll start with the free speech one. I think it's, especially for Keir Starmer and the government, it's an incredibly difficult situation to be in terms of how they regulate online platforms, how they can bring in tech providers to actually work for that. So again, I'll put some polling figures up. So Amnesty International did a poll. 73% of Gen Z report seeing some form of misogynistic content online on their For You page, whether that be TikTok, Instagram, whatever. And UCL actually did a study. So they set up a TikTok account, recorded the levels of misogynistic content that were there on the page to begin with, and then left the page alone, didn't do anything with it for 5 days, and then re-recorded the amount of content available, visible on the page. And the amount of misogynistic content increased by 400%. And that's without doing anything to alter the page. So there is this significant issue in terms of policing it. And again, as someone who is very pro-free speech and very hesitant to, lay down particular regulations to impede on free speech, I'm cautious to see what the government does, whether it's like a blanket ban on particular things or whether it's, like I say, working in partnership and hand in hand with tech providers. But I think that's a very, tight balancing act to achieve. In terms of the point the gentleman at the back there made about, whether parties should pander to the younger generation, I think you're incorrect to suggest that it's either one or the other. I don't think the parties necessarily have to choose between putting forward policies that support young people and putting forward policies that support old people. I think parties can be a broad church and they can suggest a number of policies that benefit all parties. And then the point here at the end, you seem rather supportive of autocratic regimes, so I guess you're in the 54% of Gen Zers who are supportive of that. But all I would say to that, I suppose, would you want Nigel Farage as a dictator? Because I certainly wouldn't. And I know.
Would he be a dictator?
Pardon?
Would he be a dictator?
Well, I would rather not delve into that. The idea of him being a leader in any capacity scares me, let alone.
He's an elected MP now.
He is, and that's incredibly worrying. And I don't particularly want to see him at the doors of number 10. But I think, we need to. I agree there are cases of benevolent dictatorships and benevolent autocratic systems. But I think we need to be incredibly cautious about supporting those types of systems, especially when you've got individuals like Nigel Farage waiting in the wings.
Sophie, can I just pick up on one of the questions here and just ask sort of the opposite of what Oliver was talking about there? So obviously, the Conservative Party in the UK has been accused in the past of, catering its policies towards the demographic that it knows traditionally votes for them, which is older people who actually turn up to the ballot box. Whereas we saw with the youthquake of Jeremy Corbyn, it faltered because people didn't roll out of bed to actually vote. But now Labour appears to be skewing its policies towards not just this generation, but future generations. Is that about trying to not just get into power, but stay into power for longer?
Well, I think firstly, as another LSE graduate, I agree that we should have decision-making powers, but only government department graduates and no one else. I don't want the finance department making my decisions for me. I think the thing with Labour is they've got this really broad electoral coalition. That was really important, how they won this election, right? And a lot of that is not their traditional voter base, which does tend to skew younger. And so I think they're now having to kind of balance these, not just kind of cross-political, but cross-generational pressures on them in government of making these decisions of, well, how do we appeal to our, traditionally younger, maybe more socially liberal left-wing base, but also try and appeal to people who maybe have voted Conservative in the past, gave us a go this time, we want to keep their vote. That's really difficult because those generations do tend to have different priorities. People aged 18 to 24 want houses, they want rent protections, they don't really care about the triple lock. So how do you, balance those conflicting priorities and pressures? And so I think that is difficult. And I actually do think that something that Labour is maybe not necessarily paying attention to at the minute, maybe post-local elections they will, which are happening here in a few weeks' time, is the threat posed, we talk a lot about reform, the threat posed to them on the left by the Greens, in some circumstances the Liberal Democrats, maybe independent candidates. We saw that those parties were really successful at monopolising the votes of young people who maybe felt a little bit abandoned by Labour's shift to the centre. At this general election, who may have voted for Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 and 2019. And I think, we see the fallout of that already in places like Bristol, where you've got a large student population, large university educated population who are moving to the left. And I think there is a real risk that Labour is no longer the party of younger generations.
It seems to me there's, in this debate, which started off about gender differences and the gender gap, and we're getting into basically the generational gap more than the gender gap. But yes, you've got a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to know what you guys think is the reason why we see a lack of left-wing role models for men, and also, what we can be doing to kind of regulate these echo chambers online without kind of crossing the boundaries of free speech that we were talking about earlier.
Can I just follow up on that? I mean, I don't know, I'd like to ask you and anyone else who wants to comment on this. We're all hearing about misogyny online and these problems in Santa Monica, posted online and so on. And you as Americans, in my experience, when you teach a class for Americans, doesn't matter where they come from, they love the First Amendment. I mean, they just, to a man and woman, they are free speech advocates, or free speech absolutists, as some of them say. Are there any of you from the States who feel that, there should be more control on what is said on social media, that the lack of moderation we've now got on X and Facebook and all the rest of it is wrong, and that it's causing you problems? Does anyone feel that way? Well, let me ask you to put a hand up if you feel that way. Well, probably about half of you do feel that way. Have you got a comment on that?
I think that in terms of, we've just seen the extent to which unregulated free speech can cause, a spread of misinformation. It can cause, even just violence. We saw the January 6th insurrection and stuff like that, which is kind of unprecedented, stuff that we haven't seen before, and organizations of people that we haven't really seen before, having these echo chambers online and able to kind of just isolate themselves further into their biases and their hatred. So, yeah.
Let me ask you a quick question, Sophie. Where have some of these figures in the United States, particularly on the left, become unstuck? Is it because we talked before about sort of priorities, political priorities that young people would like to see, like help with housing, childcare, etc., etc.? Is it that they're also espousing certain causes that are causing young people to go to the fringes, say, for instance, on the topic of Gaza and Israel, LGBTQ rights, which is obviously a flashpoint here in the UK over the last couple of weeks after the Supreme Court decision? Is it issues or is it priorities that's causing this divide between young men and women?
I think truthfully it's a little bit of both, but I think that idea of, issues and young voters being turned off by the kind of political messaging they're hearing, I think that's really interesting, because I think as much as young men on the right, they might be being attracted to these manosphere figures because, they say it like it is and they're not politically correct and, they're not bothered about offending anyone. I think also a lot of people, not necessarily just women, but a lot of people who are being attracted to independent or more kind of further left parties than we're traditionally used to want exactly the same, but just on more liberal issues. So on Israel-Gaza, they want politicians to stop equivocating, and they want them to either condemn one side or the other. On trans rights, they want them to declare that trans women are women, and they want them to be proudly, pro-trans rights and protect that minority community. And they don't want them to do this equivocation that maybe we've seen some of the Labour Party trying to struggle with here in the UK over the last year or two. Keir Starmer's had been in really difficult situations where he's struggled to back up past statements saying trans women are women, because he's trying to juggle these two sides and make everyone happy. And I think that's just as much of a demand for people on the left as it is on the right. People are sick of these typical politician responses, and they want politicians to just tell them what they're after, what they represent, and say it like it is. And I think that's one place where a lot of politicians on both sides of the Atlantic actually get kind of stuck with younger voters. They're not just being as kind of direct and responsive as people want. I mean, in this social media age, we're all used to finding out information super quickly, and we're used to this kind of very self-satisfying politics almost, and I think people want that from their politicians as well.
Oliver?
Yeah. And I think we saw that a lot in many of the seat outcomes in the 2024 general election. Jonathan Ashworth, Fangam Debonair, a number of individuals lost, or key individuals in the Labour Party machine lost their seats. And a lot of it was as a result of single issue voting. We saw Jess Phillips almost lose her seat in Birmingham as a result of the Labour Party stance and her stance on the Israel-Gaza war. And so I think we've seen a lot of situations in recent times where issue voting has become more and more prevalent. But to this idea of left-wing role models, I mean, you talked about earlier Jeremy Corbyn and the youth quake we saw with him. We saw Clegmania in 2010 with young people. Thanks to him, we're now paying £9,000 for tuition fees. So
these are British male politicians who, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn's a great example of it. He was a radical left leader of the Labour Party, and he had huge youth support. There was a sort of wave of it, wasn't there? I mean, it passed fairly quickly, but it was there.
I mean, we saw as well Ed Miliband when he came to Labour leader in 2015. There was even massive support for him then.
Above all else, perhaps it shows the volatility.
It shows the volatility, and I think as well, we have to ask why isn't it that we're seeing the same levels of support from the older generations, older people and such. And a lot of that is to do with, the ideas that these people were espousing. I think Jeremy Corbyn was particularly unpopular with those who, for example, were comfortably middle class, or those who were owning their own homes, who tend to be people who are older. But I think as well, it's the media landscape, both social and traditional media. I mean, we saw the way that Corbyn was treated in the run-up to the 2017 election. I think one of the headlines in The Sun was, if Jeremy Corbyn gets elected, Britain will be in the coal bin, which is the most Sun headline I've possibly ever come across. But it goes to show how a lot of these left-wing individuals, these radical left-wing individuals, are kept out of power, partly in course because of the role of the media and how that impacts voters.
Well, I'm going to once again appeal for people to focus on the gender issue as well as the generational issue, but let's have a few from the students. We've got one here, and then we'll come to you. I can see your hand up. Yes.
You mentioned how left-wing individuals are partially kept out of media based kept out of these important roles because of the media. Do you think that's also why we see like less passion from the left side, especially like when we see voter turnouts? There's like often like this kind of like surprise when the right wing like wins elections or like they have this outpour of support. Why do you think that there's like such like less passion or like support from the left?
Okay, and we've got a question or comment on the other side, if we can get the microphone over there. And if anyone wants to indicate to me, yeah, there's one here. Okay, we'll come back to you. You're all doing it at very diametrically opposed places in the room. But we'll...
Keeping Pierce busy.
Hi, my name is Yanel. We touched on social media a bit earlier, and I wanted to ask how you guys think the rise of right-wing influencers with young people is also affecting this gender divide and how it will continue to affect the gender divide. You see influencers like Andrew Tate and Aiden Ross and like Logan Paul really who are appealing to very young people. Many of them aren't even of voting age. So how do you think that this rise in these big public figures is affecting this divide, and how will it continue to affect it in the future?
And can I just ask you, do you see equivalent figures? Let's say Andrew Tate is the archetypal case on the right, appealing to a lot of young men, as you say, many of them not even voting yet. Are there any equivalent figures that you're looking at on the left?
I can't think of a specific example. There's one person who is big on debates who I'm losing his name right now. But other than that, I feel like the left wing doesn't really have a lot of social media influencers.
Do you mind if I ask though, because there has been an issue with the gerontocracy of the Democratic Party, hasn't there, in the United States, stifling the voices of younger, further left people like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and other people on her side of the aisle. If anybody's got any thoughts about sort of whether or not the young voice is stifled in the United States, because here in this country, after the Jeremy Corbyn youthquake, I wouldn't say it is so much, right?
Another question and comment, yeah.
This might be a polarizing question, but you've both said that you feel that that young men have been moving to the right because they feel disenfranchised. Why do you think that the response to this feeling of disenfranchisement is to move to these hateful groups? I mean, I feel like there's a lot of organizations or groups of people who've responded to disenfranchisement through other means other than finding...
Which other means do you mean? Give us some examples.
I think like the civil rights movement is the thing that comes up to my mind first. I didn't see a lot of response to white supremacy with this idea that of like black supremacy or something. I don't know if there, but like there's not this. I don't think that other disenfranchised groups in the same way have found a space in hating the alternative. So why, if the reason men are moving right is because they're disenfranchised, is that they find a...
Just as we come to put that to our panel, I mean, in reading ahead of this, one thing that struck me was a comment that someone made about this desire for nostalgia and, you know, make America great again, take back control in the UK, and this sort of slightly backward-looking aspect of some of these far-right movements, which is the opposite of what you're describing in the 60s with the civil rights movement, where people reacted to a difficult social situation looking forward, and with this sort of new attempt to create something new. What's going on with that?
So, I mean, to go to the point there, I think, and we've seen this especially post-general election, because when Labour came in, they said that they were going to change the system, everything was going to be better. And for many people, and this is at least the case in the UK, many people haven't seen that change take effect. And so when you've got this system, as I talked about in the beginning, the establishment simply just doesn't work for these young men. And so the solution isn't to, work within the system and vote for other parties, holding this centre ground, whether that be Labour, Tory, Lib Dem, Green. The solution is to change the system in its entirety. And in the UK, that comes from voting reform.
Or just from more radical
politicians in general.
Tommy Robinson, for instance. In the future.
It's whatever is different than the current establishment view, and I think that's partly why Brexit was so successful. And I don't mean Brexit as in like the idea, but as in the campaign was successful, because people saw the system as not working in their favour, and anything that was different from the current system, no matter how
just one change.
Yeah, just one change. Anything that's not the current system, it works. And to quickly go to the point about why the left seem so poor at capitalising on this compared to the right, I think a lot of it comes to the ideas that embed themselves in left-wing politics and right-wing politics. One of the key points about right-wing politics, whether you're the Conservative Party or Reform Party, there's a sense of pragmatism. And the left focuses, I think, a lot on idealism and ideology. And the right, whilst they have that, there's a much greater sense of pragmatism, and they're willing to do what they need to do to win and to get into power. Whereas the left are much more concerned with values, ideas, etc.
Now, before you, you've handed over the mic, but it's okay. We can do this both ways. nobody has yet mentioned trad wives. Okay. We have talked about influencers on the right of the political spectrum, but the reality is there's a lot of women who are influencing women and men as well into, let's say, not even 1950s types of situations, but even, more draconian female rights like from the 1800s. Why do you think, each of you, why do you think this is happening? Why do you think this is gaining traction online and where
Is
it's
anyone
going to
here
go?
watching this, trad wives? Few nods, yeah.
We're going to ask you what you think about the trad wife phenomenon. But I mean, where on earth has this come from?
Yeah, I mean, God help my boyfriend if I was a trad wife. Like, I've been not eaten for weeks. I think it's really just, I mean, my instinct is that it is more of an American phenomenon than a British one, is my instinct. And why? I mean, I think partly that nostalgia thing. I mean, I think if you look at the state of, if you're a young person in the US and the UK today, you've got a completely unstable, terrifying global political situation that you're living in, where you don't know if there's about to be a brand new technological conflict or trade war at any second. You probably can't afford a house. You've got a kind of underwhelming paying job. You probably have a load of student loan debt. Things aren't great now, so why would you not be a bit nostalgic for a time when things seem to be much more stable and secure than they were now? And I don't know if that's partly what is feeding into that. And I think just that kind of, maybe that's what is attractive about it. And I think, the thing about, there was that question about why are men who are disenfranchised going to the right and not the left. I mean, I think it's partly that, in that I think the right has a message about going back to the old days and an old kind of infrastructure that used to work, a style of living that seemed to work for men. And women want change, and that's what the left is pushing, and so they're being attracted to that side. And so I do think that idea of either going backwards or forwards is very powerful, but for, two different reasons to do different demographics.
Let's just have another final round.
Let's give Oliver a chance to talk. I want to know what he has to say about trad wives, that's for sure.
Sophie touched on basically everything I was going to say perfectly. If you've got such a volatile world, if you've got such a chaotic world, and everything seems to be going badly, your economic situation is going badly, employment, whatever, the global political scene, a lot of these people want to feel that return to safety. Like we talked earlier, all of these messages about making America great again, taking back control, a return to a sense of normalcy or a sense of where they felt better off. And I think a lot of those...
Okay, just before we go to the students again, can I just push back a bit on this? I mean, there is a bit of a lack of perspective here, isn't there? We are not on the verge of a war in which, you've been talking a lot about the UK. We're not going to war in the foreseeable future. We have had 70 years of peace and prosperity. People are richer than they've been. I realise there are generational divides and all the rest of it, but there really is plenty in the UK. We have plenty. And I'm not saying it's evenly distributed. I'm not saying, of course, we're one of the richest societies on earth.
But if you've got more time to think about it,
so I mean, isn't there? Why are people so aggrieved when we've had peace and prosperity for decades?
Well, and again, I think it comes to this point about the generational divide. I mean, I don't want to insult you, but you're significantly older than I am. And I think you don't necessarily understand that, young people are going out into this world and they're faced with hurdle after hurdle. And I think generations previously haven't had to face, at least to the same extent. And we always hear this mantra. No, I completely, no, not Victorian England, but if we're talking, 1980s, 1990s, now we hear this mantra all the time about how the next generation is going to have it better than the previous generation. They're going to have more opportunities. They're going to have better access to all of these things. And I think for the first time in history, our generation is the one generation that doesn't necessarily see that. We talked earlier about the housing crisis, the jobs market crisis. The number of students going to university is dropping as a result of a number of things. We're seeing global instability on a level we've never seen before. It's not really that good of a situation to be in.
Owen, you are old. Women couldn't vote in the 1800s, just to remind you. Right, let's take a couple more questions from the audience. Is there anybody who is not a student, is not Gen Z, and wants to out themselves and ask a question or make a statement, please? There is somebody?
No, we have a student first of all, I think.
Oh, we'll start with the student. All right, then.
I mean, I'm a student, and I'm Gen Z.
Oh,
Gen Z.
good for you.
But
I'm jealous.
I have a comment on like what we've been talking about. I know, Oliver, you touched on earlier. I would say Gen Z's complacency and the desire to move to a whole new system rather than fixing what they already have. And I think that in the U.S. particularly, that kind of comes from, like you guys said, the seeing that things are kind of not working in our favor, the need to feel comfortable and to want to go back to when times were more comfortable, but also not acknowledging the fact that, you know, these systems that we had in the past were not beneficial for everyone and also just dangerous for others who didn't benefit from them. And I think that the reason that, you know, the divide is so large where men are more right-leaning now and women might be leaning more leftward is because certain people do not want to be adjacent to marginalized groups and also be a part of these change makers when you see in the past that the people who are change makers, they are the ones who suffer the most. Like in the civil rights movement, I will say, I'm kind of biased because I'm black, but you see, well, I would see in a lot of movies I watched when I was younger, black people are getting beat by the police. During Black Lives Matter, people are getting hit by the police. They're getting, what was it? The spray that they spray in your eyes. Mace. You're getting tear gas. You're getting hit. You're just getting, people are getting killed by police. It's just, you don't want to be amongst the people who are getting brutalized for the sake of change when you could go back to times where things were simpler for your group, in particular, white males. So I think that that may be a bigger reason why the divide is so large.
Can you pass the microphone just down one row, and there's someone in front of you who would like to speak? Yep.
Yeah, you kind of said exactly what I was going to say, but I was just going to add on, I think there's a little bit of a toxic idea about nostalgia. Of course, people who have been in power forever don't want to become a minority. I mean, that's why we have these civil rights movements, because people weren't happy with how they were being treated. So I think it's a little ironic that now, like, say, like the white population or white men are feeling not as in the spotlight, and all of a sudden the move is to these really misogynistic creators like Andrew Tate, who have a following for badgering women and sexual assault cases, and that's somehow become idolized and normalized. And I just wonder if you guys agree that there's some value in acknowledging that we can try to imagine a future where it's better for everyone, rather than having this odd idea about nostalgia in the past when it was only nostalgic for a very specific group of people. So there are definitely still injustices today that we deal with, but there were so much more back then as well. So I don't understand why you would want to leave one broken system just to go back to another broken system instead of trying to find the path forward.
Thank you very much. There are lots of hands going up now. So what we'll do is not have anyone who's spoken before, but either side of you, we've got two fresh speakers. So, yep.
Just going off of what you said, Oliver, my question is that, like you said, that if this kind of gender-based political polarization continues, right, do you see, like, what do you think are its implications on democracy and policy making in the next 20 years? Like, should we be like foreseeing a gender war in politics as well now?
And if Sophie and Oliver could be just sort of thinking about how to respond to some of these points. Yes, two down from you. Yep. Yes.
I have very little to say, but just going off of what Paige said, I think that the idea of my perception of nostalgia and groups feeling nostalgic for the past and make America great again comes from a great deal of privilege, and comes from the idea of white men not being used to not being the ones in power and not being the oppressors. And I don't think that while white men may feel disenfranchised or disadvantaged, I don't think that's necessarily valid in how white men are treated. At least, I'm not from the UK, but at least in the US.
Thank you. No, you've spoken before, so let's go to, was there someone at the front here who wants to speak for the first time? And just take one more. If there's anyone else who hasn't spoken yet, raise your hand if you want to. Yeah, one at the back. Okay, so we'll, yes.
Okay. Hi, my name is Robin. My question is in regards to this idea. We've been talking about like the gender aspect, but I think like class is a really huge discussion. I think with regard to the wives, where it's like I think it's from a place of class that you're able to even desire that. There's some women who couldn't even fathom doing that because they have to work 3 jobs. And I think that's a huge difference between the UK and the US, where I think we're honestly more racially divided, whereas here it's more of a class division. So I wanted to know what you've experienced through compared to like the left and right, how class plays a huge role in like that.
This sounds like someone who's been listening to my lectures. Well.
About to say.
And we go to the back here.
Been paying attention.
Hi, I'm Charlie. I'm the non-student you asked for before. I am just about a Gen Z though. I think I'm on the cusp between millennial and Gen Z. But speaking of the gender differences, I was recalling the 2016 primary. And although it wasn't as severe, there did seem to be some, almost a reverse of what we see today. In the, I don't know if this played out in reality, but at least the narrative was that the Bernie Sanders supporters were like all white men, sexist, against the Hillary Clinton supporters who are more, again, I don't know if this was in reality, but more women voted Hillary Clinton. So I'm just wondering, it's just an interesting reversal of what we saw now. And obviously it's not far right and far, it's not, you know, Andrew Tate level far right, but it's a right wing and a left wing that we saw in the 2016 campaign. Yeah, I was just interested in how we saw that reversal.
It's amazing to think that that was nearly 10 years ago. Makes some of us feel old in this room, actually, having covered it firsthand. So there's lots to talk about, and in particular, what I noticed from some of your questions is that there are intersectional questions that are coming up time and time again. So I would ask our panel something about this, framing it in a US context around what Peter Thiel has been saying about these issues, because he famously wrote back in 2009 that perhaps the United States should consider repealing the 22nd Amendment, which enshrines the right for women and also later on other minority groups, including the black community, to vote in America, because he said essentially that skewed things against the right in America. So, I mean, Oliver, when you see people like Peter Thiel, who are now funding, you know, J.D. Vance, the vice president, that could have a huge hand in future Republican administrations after Donald Trump can't run for another term, does it terrify you when you start to read back on what he said about repealing the 22nd Amendment?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think it's surprising that when we talk about nostalgia, the only people that are talking about nostalgia are indeed white men. We're not seeing black men, black women, Hispanic men, Hispanic women talking about, going back to the old days. It's only white men that are talking about this sense of nostalgia. And I don't think that's just the case in the US, but also in the UK. I mean, look, again, with reforms, popularity, it's almost entirely concentrated in the white population, in that white men. But the gentleman in the middle there talked about long-term implications. I don't think there's going to be, as you put it, like a gender war in terms of politics, but I think the only way that we can avoid this type of conflict from escalating even further is if the parties really recognise that there needs to be proper policies. And when I say parties, I mean the establishment parties. So here in the UK, Labour and the Conservative Party, I think they need to recognise that there needs to be policies that address these long-term systemic issues and that they get to the heart of the matter. And unless people actually see the change happen, they can talk about change all they want, but unless people feel the real long-term implications of change, if they see, for example, more money in their pockets, or when they go down to the shops or to the park, they see those policies in action. Unless they see them, change will not occur, and these long-term issues will just continue to grow.
Thank you very much. And Sophie, let's just get your final comments on what you've heard here this evening.
I mean, I think that point about intersectionality and the kind of class element in the UK is definitely a really important distinction. Not that race and ethnicity is not also part of the conversation here, particularly after the most recent general election we've had here. But I think something that I've got some family who are from the US, half my dad's side are in Austin in Texas. And so half Texan, half Scouse, quite a weird combination. But when they come over here, one of the things that they are very aware of is how much class is part of every single conversation you have. When you meet someone, straight away it's like they're at pains to say what school they went to, where they went to university, what they do for work, and it's like all these identifiers of are you like me or are you not? And I think that's really something that, for all the change in politics we've seen in the UK over the years, that is something that has remained consistent under the surface. And so I think that does feed into the fact of why are women, seemingly particularly young women, find it so much easier to transcend these class barriers, and young men are finding it so much more difficult. And that's a question that, to be honest, I can't completely, I don't have the answer to, but I think it's certainly a conversation we've got to have. And I think just the other thing I would pick up on is when I speak to, young people, I think I was born in 98, so I think I'm still technically a young person, almost, a Gen Zer. And I think, when I talk to people my age and younger, one of the things that comes up is that they just feel like this social contract has been broken almost. And I think a really good example of that is people will say, well, we stayed indoors during COVID, we didn't go to school, we didn't go to university because we were protecting older generations and our loved ones, and what have we got back for it? Political parties who don't care about us, who won't make it easier for us to get a good job or a good house. Why do I owe anything to anyone else in society when no one seems to be paying me back for what I've done? And I think that really resonates with a lot of young people, and it just manifests in very different ways. And I think it really gets to that point that was made of, why would anyone want to be a change maker or engage? There's just what's the value in it? What are you fighting for? Because it doesn't feel like anyone is listening to you anyway. And I think that's kind of a really fundamental point that's at this heart of this conversation of why is there such a gender divide between young men and women in this country. I think it all actually comes back to that one point, but it just manifests in very different directions.
I can't believe we've come to the end of this hour in such a polite and gender-balanced fashion with, each one of us having enough time to not hog the microphone, or gender-balanced audience and age-balanced and so on and so forth. I think it's about time for me to bring this episode of Control-Alt-Deceit to a close.
And Control-Alt-Deceit, thank you very much, I should say, to Oliver and Sophie for helping us through this. And Control-Alt-Deceit is produced and edited by Piers Lynch in association with Democratis. This is Owen Bennett-Jones.
And I'm Nina Dos Santos. And if you want to stay up to date with updates for our next episodes and have a listen to some of the snippets of these conversations that we've had here at NYU London, you're very welcome to on our various social media channels. We're on X at CTRL_danger. We've also got a YouTube channel, and we're on Blue Sky, LinkedIn, and much more. We'll see you again soon for another episode of Control-Alt-Deceit. Thanks so much for staying with us until the end of this episode of Control-Alt-Deceit. We really hope that you've enjoyed this week's show. And don't forget that every week on a Friday, we'll be releasing new shows and new material as well via our social media channels. You can subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts from, and follow snippets of the show on Twitter, where our X handle is at CTRL_danger, or X if you call that platform that, and Blue Sky and LinkedIn as well. We also have a YouTube channel too. Please subscribe, and also don't forget to comment on the podcast. That way more people get to hear about it.